There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a building when it has been emptied of its purpose. Not the silence of a place at rest, but the silence of something interrupted. In April of 2026, that silence descended on the most recognizable structure on the Dubai coastline. The Burj Al Arab, the sail-shaped tower that spent more than 2 decades as the physical emblem of a city's ambition, closed its doors. All 202 suites, every restaurant, every wellness facility, shut. The official explanation arrived with the measured language of institutional confidence. The Jumeirah Group described the closure as a long-planned restoration program, a carefully phased investment in the property's future. 18 months of work. A reopening scheduled for October of 2027. The hotel had operated continuously since its opening in December of 1999. 27 years without a comprehensive renovation, and the time had come, so the statement went, to renew the icon for the next generation of ultra-luxury travel. It was a coherent story, and on its own terms it was not entirely false. The building is nearly 3 decades old. The interiors, however spectacular they once were conceived in the late 1990s. The competition in Dubai's luxury hospitality sector has expanded enormously since then. A renovation of this scale was, at some point, genuinely necessary. The appointment of French interior architect Tristan Auer, whose credits include the restoration of the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris, signaled a serious commitment to the project's quality. But here is the problem with the official story. It asks you to accept a very particular coincidence of timing. The Burj Al Arab announced its closure in April of 2026. The Armani Hotel Dubai, located inside the Burj Khalifa, closed on the 1st of April of the same year for a full renovation, with a planned reopening in the final quarter of 2026. The St. Regis. The Palm suspended most of its operations in mid-April, keeping only its lobby lounge and bar open through August. The Park Hyatt Dubai followed. The Radisson Blu Dubai Media City followed. Atlantis Dubai paused several of its flagship dining venues, including dinner by Heston Blumenthal and Hakkasan, citing a review of concepts. All of this happened within a window of approximately 6 weeks. All of it framed as planned, strategic, long-term thinking. None of it, according to official communications, connected to what had been happening in the skies above Dubai since late February of 2026. That framing requires a degree of credulity that the data does not support. Because by April of 2026, Dubai's tourism sector was not experiencing a slowdown. It was experiencing something far closer to a structural rupture. The numbers behind that rupture and the forces that produced it are what make the closure of the Burj Al Arab something more than a renovation story. They make it a diagnostic moment. A city that built everything on the premise of perpetual arrival was suddenly and very visibly confronting the cost of that bet. To understand what the silence of the Burj Al Arab actually means, you have to start not with the building, but with the event that emptied it. You have to go back to the last weekend of February of 2026 and to a plume of smoke rising over the port of Jebel Ali. In January of 2026, Dubai's hospitality sector was performing at levels that would have seemed extraordinary almost anywhere else in the world. 5-star hotels across the Emirate were running at an average occupancy rate of 82%. The city had welcomed 19.5 million international tourists the previous year. Its network of 827 hotels, including 173 5-star establishments, was operating near capacity during what is traditionally the strongest season of the year. The projections for 2026 had been optimistic. The Gulf region as a whole had been forecasting tourism growth of 13%. Dubai, with its combination of connectivity, infrastructure, and brand recognition, was positioned to lead that expansion. Then came the 28th of February. On that date, United States and Israeli military forces conducted strikes on Iranian military installations. The regional response was immediate and kinetic. Iran launched retaliatory drone and missile attacks across Gulf nations. Dubai was struck. A plume of smoke rose from the port of Jebel Ali, visible from the coastline. The Fairmont. The Palm sustained minor exterior damage from drone debris. The Burj Al Arab itself, according to subsequent reporting, suffered minor exterior damage as well. Dubai International Airport, at that point the busiest aviation hub in the world by international passenger volume, was targeted in the early stages of the conflict. No lasting structural damage was visible to passengers in the weeks that followed, but the psychological damage was instantaneous and global. Within days, the bookings stopped. Not slowed, stopped. By the week ending March 14th, Dubai's five-star hotel occupancy had collapsed to 22.8%. That figure represented the lowest occupancy level recorded in the Emirates since April of 2020, at the height of the global pandemic. In the space of roughly 2 weeks, the city had shed nearly 60 percentage points of hotel demand. The speed of that collapse had no modern precedent outside of a direct public health emergency. The numbers that followed made the scale of the damage concrete. Moody's, the financial services company, projected that hotel occupancy across Dubai would fall to roughly 10% in the second quarter of 2026. Their analysts described this as, in their words, an effective shutdown of large parts of the hospitality sector. Research by Tourism Economics estimated that between 23 million and 38 million fewer people would travel to the Middle East across the full year of 2026. Oxford Economics placed the potential loss in visitor spending at between $34 billion and $56 billion globally. Daily losses in tourism-related revenue across the region were estimated at $600 million. Mamoun Hamaidan, the chief business officer at Wago, one of the region's leading travel platforms, reported that hotel occupancy across Dubai had dropped to a range of 15 to 20%. For a city where the supply of hotel rooms had been continuously expanded to meet what had appeared to be insatiable demand, the surplus of empty inventory created immediate and severe financial pressure. Properties that had been charging rates approaching $5,000 per night for premium suites were offering discounts of 50% or more in an attempt to generate any occupancy at all. The human dimension of the collapse extended beyond economics. 11 people were killed across the UAE, and more than 185 were injured, casualties from falling debris and strike damage. The psychological shift from Dubai as a safe aspirational destination to Dubai as a conflict-adjacent zone was, as analysts noted, a reputational wound that no diplomatic agreement could quickly close. A ceasefire was negotiated by April 8th, but confidence in a destination is not restored by a ceasefire. It is rebuilt slowly through months of stable operations, consistent air connectivity, and the gradual return of the positive associations that draw leisure travelers in the first place. And in the meantime, the question that every hotel operator, every restaurant group, every luxury retailer in Dubai was asking was a practical one. What do you do with a fully staffed, fully operational luxury property when the guests have stopped coming? The answer that Dubai's hospitality establishment arrived at, almost in unison, was you close for renovation. You convert the vacancy into an investment. You transform the absence of guests from a crisis into a strategy. And it was in that context, not the context of long-term planning, that the decisions about the Burj Al Arab, the Armani Hotel, and a dozen other properties were made, or at least accelerated, in the spring of 2026. There is a telling detail buried in the reporting on Dubai's wave of hotel closures in the spring of 2026. It comes from a source within the Jumeirah Group's parent company, Dubai Holding, quoted in the French hospitality trade publication Voyageurs d'Affaires. The source described the internal conversation at senior management level in the following terms: the current period of tension, while forcing the Jumeirah Group to adjust its 2026 forecasts, was seen internally as an opportunity. The direct quote attributed to top management was this: "Let's use CapEx. Let's do these renovations now." That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. Capital expenditure, the investment in physical assets that hotels must periodically make to remain competitive, is always expensive to deploy when a property is operational. You cannot gut and rebuild interior systems, replace structural elements, or redesign guest-facing spaces while paying guests or occupying the rooms above and below the construction zone. The disruption is incompatible with the product, and so, across the global hospitality industry, the general rule is that major renovations happen during periods of lower demand, or in phases designed to minimize disruption to revenue. What Dubai's spring of 2026 offered was something the industry almost never encounters: a sudden, complete, and involuntary evacuation of demand across an entire market, affecting multiple competitors simultaneously. In that environment, the cost-benefit calculation for renovation shifted entirely. The opportunity cost of closing a property, the revenue you sacrifice by not operating, dropped towards zero because there was almost no revenue to sacrifice. The renovation that would have required years of careful phasing could now be executed in a single continuous burst. The Armani Hotel Dubai moved first, announcing its closure on the 1st of April of 2026. The hotel, which occupies the lower floors of the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, had been operating since 2010. Its closure was described as a complete renovation, with a planned reopening in the final quarter of the year. The timing, framed as coincidental with the conflict, raised eyebrows among industry observers, given that the announcement came precisely 5 weeks after the initial strikes. The Burj Al Arab followed in mid-April, with the 18-month closure that would silence the city's most recognizable hospitality landmark until October of 2027. Unlike the Armani closure, which was designed to be completed within a calendar year, the Burj Al Arab's program was substantially more ambitious. The project was to be led by Tristan Auer and would involve not just interior redesign but structural system updates and the kind of deep infrastructure work that an aging building of its complexity, 321 meters high, built on a man-made island 280 meters off Jumeirah Beach, supported by 250 concrete piles driven 40 meters into the seabed, genuinely requires after more than 25 years of continuous operation. The St. Regis The Palm announced mid-April closures of most of its services, maintaining only its lobby lounge and bar through the end of August. The Park Hyatt Dubai entered a similar holding pattern. The Radisson Blu Dubai Media City followed suit. And at Atlantis Dubai, the decision was made to pause several of the resort's highest-profile dining concepts, dinner by Heston Blumenthal, Hakkasan, and the underwater restaurant Oceano among them, while management reviewed their direction. What distinguishes this wave of closures from normal renovation cycles is not just the timing, it is the simultaneity. In a healthy market, staggered renovation timelines represent a competitive calculation. You do not want to go dark at the same time as your direct competitors, because guests who cannot stay with you will establish loyalty with someone else. The fact that multiple flagship properties across different ownership structures, Jumeirah Group, Marriott's St. Regis brand, Hyatt, and the independent Atlantis, all converged on the same narrow window suggests that the competitive calculation had been suspended. There were no guests to lose to a competitor. There was no penalty for going dark simultaneously because the market itself had gone dark. It is also worth noting what this pattern reveals about the relationship between Dubai's luxury hospitality sector and its ownership structure. Dubai Holding, the state-linked investment company that owns Jumeirah Group, effectively set the tone for the market. When the sovereign investment vehicle decides to convert crisis into capital expenditure, the signal to the rest of the market is clear. This is the moment to act. The private operators who followed were, in a sense, reading the room correctly. The concept of opportunistic capital expenditure is not new to the hospitality industry. It has a long and reasonably well-documented history in the aftermath of demand shocks, the September of 2001 attacks in the United States, the SARS outbreak in 2003, the global financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic of 2020. In each of those episodes, hotel operators who had the financial resilience to invest during the trough emerged from the recovery period with fresher properties, better-positioned brands, and a competitive advantage over peers who had deferred maintenance and renovation because they lacked either the cash or the conviction. The logic is straightforward. Renovation during a trough eliminates the opportunity cost that makes renovations so painful in normal times. A hotel operating at 80% occupancy and charging $5,000 a night cannot afford to close for 18 months. The revenue sacrifice would be enormous, but a hotel operating at 15% occupancy and offering 50% discounts is already, in financial terms, barely a business. The decision to close is no longer a sacrifice. It is a reclassification of loss. In the case of the Burj Al Arab specifically, the financial architecture of the decision deserves closer examination. The hotel had been operating continuously for 27 years. Its interior design, conceived in the 1990s, was last substantially updated in the mid-2010s. The competitive landscape it operates in had changed dramatically. Properties like the Atlantis The Royal, which opened in 2023, had reset the visual and experiential benchmarks for ultra-luxury hospitality in Dubai. The Address Hotel's expansion, the one and only one Zarbil, and a series of new ultra-premium openings had collectively raised the bar to a level that the Burj Al Arab's existing interiors could no longer match. There was, in other words, a genuine renovation imperative that existed independently of the conflict. The question was not whether to renovate, but when. And what the spring of 2026 provided was a window in which the answer to when became unambiguous. The appointment of Tristan Auer reinforces the argument that this was not a purely reactive decision. Auer's engagement on a project of this scale requires substantial lead time for design development, contract negotiation, and procurement of materials and craftsmen appropriate for a building of the Burj Al Arab specification. His previous work on the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris, a multi-year, multi-hundred million dollar program that preserved the landmark's identity while rebuilding it from the inside, is the closest analogue to what Dubai Holding is attempting here. That kind of engagement is not arranged in 6 weeks. The design brief was almost certainly in development before the 1st of March. What the conflict did then was not create the renovation. It created the permission to execute it without the financial penalty that would normally accompany an 18-month closure of a property generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The conflict converted an already planned investment from a painful sacrifice into something that looked, on a spreadsheet, almost neutral. That is the official logic. And it is, in narrow financial terms, defensible, but it leaves several important questions unanswered. The most significant of them is this. If Dubai's flagship hospitality assets required this level of investment to remain competitive, and they clearly did, why had that investment been deferred for so long? The Burj Al Arab had been operating for 27 years without a comprehensive renovation. The Armani Hotel had been operating for 16 years. The St. Regis. The Palm had been in operation for over a decade. The answer to that question leads directly into the structural dynamics that the conflict exposed but did not create. Before the first drones struck Jebel Ali, before the bookings stopped, before the Burj Al Arab went dark, the structural vulnerability of Dubai's tourism economy was already visible in the architecture of the model itself. It was visible in the numbers, in the composition of demand, and in the historical record of what happens to this city when the external world stops arriving. Dubai's tourism model, as it had been constructed over roughly 3 decades, was built almost entirely on international long-haul demand. The Emirates' own population, approximately 3.6 million people, of whom roughly 90% are expatriates, does not generate a domestic tourism base in any meaningful sense. The residents of Dubai are not, in general, spending their weekends in 5-star hotels in their own city. The business of filling those rooms at the rates those rooms command depends on a continuous flow of visitors from Europe, North America, South Asia, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, it depends on the 2 segments that are most sensitive to perceived risk: international leisure travelers and corporate travelers. These are precisely the 2 segments that disappeared first when the conflict began. Leisure travelers cancelled at the first sign of regional instability. Corporate travel policies, which are typically governed by risk assessment frameworks and government travel advisories, suspended or restricted travel to the UAE within days of the initial strikes. Both segments share a common characteristic. They are highly mobile. When Dubai becomes unavailable or inadvisable, they do not stop traveling. They redirect. The data from 2026 confirm this with unusual clarity. Tourist demand that evacuated the Gulf did not disappear globally. It moved to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to East Africa, to the Caribbean. The research firm Coverpage Media described this as a live case study in demand concentration risk, the clearest the travel industry had seen since the early days of the pandemic. The structural dependency on international arrivals had been documented long before 2026. In the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, Dubai's property market collapsed with a speed and severity that shocked even those who had identified the bubble. House prices fell 40% in the first 3 months of 2009, a rate of decline that surpassed anything recorded elsewhere in the world at that moment. The mechanism was the same, a withdrawal of external capital and external confidence that the domestic economy had no buffer to absorb. Abu Dhabi was required to inject approximately $25 billion in bailout funds to stabilize the emirate. A decade later, the pandemic of 2020 produced the same dynamic in compressed form. Hotel occupancy collapsed to near zero in April of 2020. Aviation ground to a halt. The recovery, when it came, was faster than most analysts expected, partly because of Dubai's aggressive approach to reopening, and partly because pent-up demand from international travelers was substantial. But the recovery obscured the lesson. The speed with which demand returned was interpreted as evidence of Dubai's resilience, when it was more accurately evidence of the global travel market's resilience. Dubai had not diversified its demand base. It had simply been fortunate that the demand returned. By the beginning of 2026, the numbers that appeared strongest in Dubai's tourism profile were also the numbers that most clearly illustrated the dependency. 82% average hotel occupancy in January of 2026. 84.8% occupancy across the first 2 months of the year. 19.5 million international visitors in 2025. These figures represented the apex of a model that had never been tested against a sustained regional security disruption, because no such disruption had previously occurred while Dubai was operating at this scale. The city had also, over the preceding decade, dramatically expanded its supply of luxury and ultra-luxury hotel rooms. The pipeline of new 5-star properties had been built on the assumption that international demand would continue to grow at the rates projected before 2026. When that demand collapsed, the surplus of inventory was not a minor inconvenience. It was a structural overhang that placed immediate downward pressure on rates, on occupancy, and on the financial viability of newer properties that had not yet had time to establish the brand loyalty that insulates older properties during downturns. What the conflict of 2026 did was not create a new vulnerability. It activated an existing one. The Burj Al Arab closing its doors was not the cause of anything. It was a symptom, perhaps the most visible and symbolically loaded symptom, of a tourism economy that had been running at maximum capacity on a single engine, with no redundancy built into the system and no serious contingency for the moment that engine was disrupted. There is a phrase that appeared in the commentary of Dubai-based architects and urban analysts when the Burj Al Arab closure was announced. Several of them, speaking independently to different publications, reached for a variation of the same formulation. The renovation, they said, reflected Dubai's transition from a rapid creation phase to a strategic curation of its legacy assets. The city that once defined itself by what it was building was now being asked to define itself by how it maintained what it had already built. It is an elegant framing, and it captures something real about the long arc of Dubai's development. The phase of maximum spectacle, the Palm Islands, the world's tallest building, the indoor ski slopes, the 7-star hotel on a man-made island, belong to a specific historical moment. That moment has passed. The task of the next phase is different. It is not to produce new landmarks, but to ensure that existing ones retain their relevance in a global luxury market that has become far more competitive and far more discerning than it was in 1999. But the elegance of that framing should not be allowed to obscure a harder question. The Burj Al Arab closed in 2026, not primarily because Dubai had reached a reflective maturity. It closed because the tourists stopped coming. The renovation was genuine in its intent. The design investment was serious, the architect was world-class, but the timing was dictated by a crisis, not by a strategic calendar, and the distinction matters, because it tells you something important about the relationship between Dubai's stated narrative and its actual situation. A city in genuine strategic maturity does not wait for a geopolitical shock to find the window for renovating its most iconic property. It builds that window into its planning. The fact that the Burj Al Arab went 27 years without a comprehensive renovation, accumulating deferred maintenance and design obsolescence across nearly 3 decades of continuous operation, suggests that the investment had been perpetually postponed in favor of revenue generation. The asset was producing income. The renovation could wait, it always could wait. Until it could not. The same logic applies to the broader pattern of closures. Multiple flagship luxury properties in the same market, all requiring renovation, all converging on the same crisis window to execute that renovation simultaneously. This is not evidence of mature strategic planning. It is evidence of a sector that had been operating on a growth assumption so robust that the normal discipline of asset maintenance had been subordinated to the priority of keeping the rooms full and the revenue flowing. What 2026 exposed is the cost of that subordination. The cost is not just financial, though it is financial in a significant way. Tourism economics and Oxford economics projected losses in the tens of billions of dollars. Daily regional tourism revenue losses were running at $600 million. The long-term reputational damage, the psychological distance between the phrase Dubai and the word safe that the conflict opened up in the minds of international travelers, is harder to quantify but potentially more consequential than the short-term revenue figures. The deeper cost is structural. Dubai's tourism model, as it stood at the beginning of 2026, had no meaningful buffer against external shocks. Its occupancy rates were exceptional. Its brand was globally recognized. Its infrastructure was world-class. But all of that excellence rested on a single pillar: the uninterrupted arrival of international visitors, primarily from markets that Dubai does not control and cannot influence when their governments issue travel advisories or when their airlines suspend routes. The historical pattern suggests that Dubai will recover, the V-shaped recovery from the 2009 debt crisis, the unexpectedly rapid rebound from the 2020 pandemic. The city has demonstrated before that its underlying demand is resilient when the disruption is temporary and when no permanent structural damage has been done to the brand. The question that 2026 raises, and that the silence of the Burj Al Arab makes audible in a way that balance sheets and occupancy statistics do not, is whether the recovery will be accompanied by any meaningful structural change, or whether the city will simply return to the same model on the same terms, waiting for the next shock. The Burj Al Arab will reopen in October of 2027 with interiors designed by one of the most respected architects in the world. It will almost certainly be more beautiful than it was before. It will almost certainly command rates that reflect its renewed status. The tourists will return, as they have returned before, drawn by a destination that has spent 3 decades building the kind of global recognition that takes generations to construct and only moments to disrupt. But the building that reopens in 2027 will stand in a city that has been reminded, at considerable cost, of the price of building everything on the assumption of perpetual arrival. The sail shape of the Burj Al Arab has always been read as a symbol of motion, a city perpetually setting out towards something new. In the spring of 2026, for the first time in its history, the sail went still. Whether what follows is a genuine reckoning with the structural vulnerabilities that moment exposed, or simply a return to the same wind, is the question that Dubai will spend the next several years answering.